Welcome to session 6 of today, and the final session of the day. Of course, it is the last session, therefore everyone is obviously wanting to get out. So today, the session on session 6 is the economics of naval shipbuilding. This will no doubt be an extremely interesting presentation by two distinguished speakers. The first speaker today, of course, is Rear Admiral Rowan Moffitt of the Future Submarine program. As the head of the Future Submarine program, Rear Admiral Moffitt will be discussing his views of this Future Submarine program, and it's about all I have to advise you about what he intends to say. It will be, no doubt, not a surprise to you. So, Admiral Moffitt, over to you, please.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you. And thank you for coming along to listen to this session. May I also, to the journalists in the room, thank them for the flurry of Christmas New Year activity on the Future Submarine program, including Professor Ergas, who very successfully kept me in touch with my office when I was otherwise would only have been on leave. So thank you for that. There was quite a deal of discussion, actually, on the Future Submarine program, and from a range of perspectives, which is good and increasingly not unusual, and I'm happy about that too, because I think it's important that there be a good discussion publicly about this program for many reasons and from many perspectives. But as usual, or as is becoming usual, I think, there was not much discussion about what I think is the key question, and that is why? Why submarines? What do we want submarines to do? Where do we think we might want them to do that? And how long do we think we might want them to stay there? They're all quite key questions, which I'm not going to canvass today. And of course, in the media coverage, the Collins-class submarines got their usual going over. Now, these two topics, Collins and the future submarines, are in fact not at all easily separated one from the other. To get to the future, whatever that future might look like, we must start from the present. And I'm reminded of the Australian tourist in Cornwall asking a local farmer for directions to London, to be told, well, if I was going to London, I wouldn't start from here. And we might well say that too. But start from here we must. And there are many things that are very positive about the start point. At this stage, my team and I are charting for government the options for getting from here to their defence policy objective of 12 future submarines. I'll talk a little bit later about where we are now, but I'm a simple navigator, and I feel most comfortable starting with an understanding of the destination. I know where we are, but where we're going needs to be very clearly and comprehensively identified before I can scope for government the options for getting there. Now, we know that the plan is for 12 submarines more capable than Collins, but the 2009 Defence White Paper says some other important things too. In the strategic hedging section of Chapter 3, at paragraph 321, there's a comment about identification of circumstances that might justify acquiring more than 12 submarines. And perhaps more importantly, at paragraph 9.9, it says the construction program for the future submarines will be designed to provide the government with the option to continue building additional submarines in the 2030s and beyond. This is a really important requirement and instruction to me, with very significant implications for the way the program is put together. And I'm going to explain that a little. Now, very broadly speaking, the process for bringing the first of a new class of any submarine, any sort of submarine, into service, no matter what submarine, is a process that will have 4 fundamental building blocks of activity, although the boundaries between those building blocks may not be as sharply defined as my graphics will suggest. The first is defining the capabilities and performance characteristics that we want and explaining why, and getting government to agree. The white paper is the vision, but that needs much more detail before we can turn it into a submarine. This phase can take some years to do properly, and in that time we have to develop a pretty good feel, not just for what we want, but also for what options and trade-offs might exist and the implications, the pros and the cons of each, and from a number of different perspectives. International program management academics write that skimping on this part of the process, that is, not properly defining clear capability objectives for the program, is a key reason why big programs fail, and I choose to class this as a big program. In this phase, there is cost-benefit analysis undertaken, some of that by my team, but some of it was undertaken before that during the force structure review that led to the development of the white paper work. And in that phase, alternatives to submarines, the capabilities that those alternatives might deliver and their cost, risk and schedule profile were examined. Now, during that process too, options other than submarines which were considered were done in some detail. The detail of that work is not published, quite simply because it's fairly sensitive and fairly highly classified work. But once we've got to the point of government agreement on the capability that it wants, or the capability options or submarine option sets, if you like, that it wants further developed, and broadly how we're going to go about doing that, we can start doing some design work. An off-the-shelf option will probably require little, but in any case much less design effort than would be required for a new design. A new design submarine might take 7 to 8 years of effort, as the RAND Corporation has told us in the report that was published last year. Or in other words, somewhere between 8 and 12 million man-hours of design effort. Once the design work of the submarine to be built has been sufficiently progressed to a mature enough state and the accurate cost estimates sufficient to reach government agreement have been approved by government, then we can start building. Submarines typically take between 4 years and 8 years to build. Since the next submarine that Australia builds will be the first that it's built in probably well over a decade, I think it's reasonable for us to plan and expect that it will probably take us closer to 8 than it will to 4 years to build, regardless of the submarine, I would suggest. Operational testing and evaluation will be done once the submarine is handed over to the Navy from the builder, so that we can work out exactly how it works, exactly what the capability is that we have, and the best way to use it operationally. We would not have an operational capability until that work is adequately done. So for a submarine of a completely new design, which would require the longest to execute of all of the available options, it would take us around 20 years from starting the definition process to having the first one of the submarines available for operational use. Experienced people that we talk to overseas all agree on that basic construct. But they also note that it assumes that you're starting with a workforce that's ready to do the job. Not necessarily ready to build, but ready to do the definition work, ready to do the design work, ready when the time comes to do the build work. Subsequent submarines should take less time to build than the first one. But that doesn't necessarily mean in our context that it would translate to a faster or even an increasing delivery rate. In Australia's case, the rate of delivery of follow-on submarines must take into account, firstly, how quickly our strategic circumstances demand that the submarine force must grow, but a couple of other important factors as well. First, the Navy is required eventually to double the size of its submarine force, and it has to grow the crews for this larger fleet, starting from today, which is a less than optimal numerical start point for the submarine force. There's no point in delivering the submarines if the crews for them don't exist, and growing those people takes time. For example, using our current models, to grow just one new commanding officer, you need to start with 8 people off the street and work on them for about 15 years to get one. So this suggests to me that we might need to deliver the submarines a little more slowly than we have seen in past naval construction programs in Australia. So if we deliver the new submarines at, say, 2-year intervals, the build program will run over 24 years. New technology will emerge in that time that we will want to incorporate into the design. For example, we're on the threshold right now of a major advance in submarine battery technology, from lead-acid batteries to lithium-based batteries. When that technology is mature, it promises considerable operational performance and other improvements for the submarine, but it will also demand potentially very significant design changes, particularly if we're trying to insert that technology into the build program after we have begun. There will be other advances in technology over the course of a long build program like this as well, and even now we can see that there are quite a few promising technologies emerging that we would want to exploit in the future at some stage. So if we don't refresh the design periodically to incorporate new technology as we go, some of those refreshes might be smaller or larger, then the later submarines will be obsolete when we deliver them. And this suggests to me that we need to build in batches, which will require some, and perhaps some significant, design activity to be devoted to each batch. And assuming that we use the contemporary model, where the submarines are designed for a 30-year life of type, as we deliver submarine number 12, and these are notionally batches of 4, they could equally easily be batches of 3, they could equally be batch 1 is 2, batch 3 is 7, batch, whatever. Other things will drive the size of the batches. As we deliver submarine number 12, submarine number 1 will be approaching retiring age. So we'll have to start building a replacement, and so on, ad infinitum. So the white paper requirement for a program that allows the government the option to keep building more submarines into the future is within reach just because we're building a force of 12. As well as the need, therefore, for continuous design and development activity throughout the program, in a program that will run for close to half a century, for the first time, we will move into the major maintenance and upkeep phase for the new submarines well before the construction phase is finished. So we will need not only to be evolving the design and building the new submarines, but maintaining the in-service submarines all concurrently. Experienced advice tells us that building and in-service maintenance demand some skill sets that differ quite significantly one from the other, especially in planning, schedule optimisation and management. We must therefore make sure that we structure the program so that both are done properly and that one does not detract or distract from the other. So then once it starts, the future submarine program will run for a very long time and may perhaps not finish. Regardless of that, it will demand the establishment and the management successfully of 3 quite different functional activities running concurrently, each one challenging in its own right: design, building the new submarines, and upkeep of submarines in service. So what we face with the future submarine program is much more than just building 12 submarines. It requires that Australia assemble the elements of a capability needed to sustain over a very long time a complex, demanding and high technology enterprise. That enterprise in its totality must exist regardless of which submarine we acquire and regardless of which elements we decide should be in Commonwealth ownership, available commercially in Australia, or done on our behalf overseas. So for these reasons, and others, the Future Submarines program is unlike any other major defence capital acquisition program that we've seen in Australia. And this fact, and I think it is a fact, suggests to me that we have to think quite differently about how we're going to execute it, especially since we wouldn't want to start from here to get to London. For a start, while it will certainly cost a lot of money, that funding will be spread over a very long period of time. The sorts of program costs that we've seen around in the media will be spread over decades, unlike similar costs attributed to NBN, spread over much less than a decade. The annual expenditure will be relatively small compared with the total program cost. It will in fact be a set of circumstances which is more about cash flow management and causing us to think differently about budgeting rather than being a question of total cost. While the total cost is unquestionably a very important issue, the whole notion of total cost in a program of this nature is very much harder to get a sensible understanding of than for some other programs. How much have we spent to have a destroyer and frigate force of about 11 or 12 ships over the past 40 or 50 years? And could we possibly have estimated that cost with any sense of accuracy when we started? I suggest not, because when we started it, we didn't know all of the perambulations that we would take along the way. The Future Submarines program is also one that gives us the opportunity to consider different paradigms. I mentioned a contemporary model of a 30-year life of type a minute ago. With the pace of change of technology, that's a very long time. So our practice has been to do major capability upgrades during the in-service life. Now, these upgrades have had variable success. Some have been very successful, but they have always been expensive, and they have always taken ships out of service for a very long time. Major upgrades on submarines are necessarily harder to do because it's harder to get at things in the first place. So the whole activity is inherently going to be potentially longer. Certainly it's going to be more difficult, costly and risky. An alternative, therefore, might be to consider a design or a paradigm in which the submarine has a shorter life of type, with no major upgrades during the course of its life. Initial rough estimates that my staff have done suggest that a submarine service life of around 20 years, with no mid-life upgrades, may allow us to make savings in total ownership costs of somewhere between 5 and 8%, which is not trivial, and we certainly shouldn't ignore it. And there are other benefits that might accrue from such a model as well. The lower average age of the fleet would, I think, certainly could, reduce upkeep costs, and as we know only too well from our recent experience, old ships are proportionately much more unreliable and expensive to maintain than younger ones, and submarines are no different. No longer would there be a need to have submarines out of service in upgrade for long periods. Technology refreshes would be delivered in successive batches of new submarines, with the number of submarines in each batch varied to suit the key technology maturity points. Regardless of whether we take this approach, though, or some other, the very different nature of this program should prompt us to think very carefully about the approach that we take to achieving what the government very clearly sees as a vital strategic military capability for Australia's security future. There seems little doubt that one challenge we will face stems from the fact that in a mature state, the future submarine capability enterprise will require Australia's Navy first, and naval shipbuilding industry sector and associated elements, the other elements of the national machinery that we choose to own ourselves in this country to support them, its infrastructure and its human capital to be bigger than they are today. But note that the early workforce analyses that I've seen, and most recently this week, suggest that we will not need dramatically more people than we actually have in the enterprise today. Certainly, we are talking thousands of people in total, but we're not talking tens of thousands of people in total. In this context, I was very heartened late last year talking to the chairman of Skills Australia to find him very confident in our capability, and not only our capability, in which we should have confidence anyway, but also in our capacity to execute successfully the Future Submarines program. Another key factor for the first time in any part of Navy's capability will be that the larger submarine force will provide the steady, reliable, predictable workflow needed to sustain the key lines of activity in the enterprise in the long term, and to do that without the need for exports, for exporting any product, which I suggest would be very problematic for us, no matter which submarine we choose. But we have to decide very carefully what makes the most sense for us to own, what we don't need to own but need to control here in Australia, and what we can safely, reliably and cost-effectively have done for us by others. We also need to understand the risks associated with doing that for a strategic capability of this nature. This calculus will be very important to get right, and it goes without saying that no matter what approach we take to this problem, Australia will have to pay for it. When we had the Oberon class, we became acknowledged as a competent submarine operating nation and as competent submarine maintainers. It worked well for us, in part because we could draw on the expertise not just of the Oberon designer, the builders, the integrators, the original equipment manufacturers and the maintainers of submarines, but also the parent Navy that spawned that submarine. All those elements are critical to a successful capability outcome. When the Royal Navy stopped using the Oberons, it quickly, with the exception of the combat system developments that we'd done ourselves, it quickly became much harder for us to do the maintenance task, and we had to rely on ourselves that much more. When we did the Collins class, there was no other Navy using our submarine. No one else was performing maintenance work, no one researching solutions to problems that arose in service, and no one who understood how we used the submarines and why. Until Collins, the RAN had no real experience of just how critical these functions are to a Navy in keeping the capabilities that it owns effective, or how extensive they are. They are what we have come to know as the parent Navy obligations. Now, Australia built the Collins-class submarines and did so to world-class standards of quality, and according to the Chairman of Skills Australia, we can do that again. But if we're going to have a real submarine capability that we can rely on in the future, then we must make sure that the various parental responsibilities are properly met. Be they design, integration, build, maintenance, development or operation related, they must be met by us or by someone else. We must structure the program, the total enterprise for the future submarine capability, with certainty around how all these responsibilities will be met, knowing by whom, where and when, and at what cost. In short, we have to take responsibility for maturing for this program from a mindset of being a Navy operating a fleet to being a nation owning a Navy. Some of the work we've done so far helps us to understand exactly where we currently stand on the pathway to that level of maturity. The RAND report on designing Australia's future submarine paints us a fairly clear picture in respect of our capabilities and capacities today for designing a submarine. I want to stress it's about designing, it's not about building, that report. It makes it clear that we will have a heavy reliance on overseas help to close the gap between where we are today and where we need to be for the future submarines. So we're going to need to build and develop more than just acquisition options for government to consider. We must also select the best partners to help us deliver the total capacity and capability we need to do the whole job and to continue to do it well into the future. What we're going to need are partners able and willing to help us get to the level we have fallen short of with Collins, the level of parent Navy, so that we can produce the outcome that the government wants, which I think is a sufficiently capable submarine force that is available, reliable, cost-effective and affordable. Or expressed another way, industry players need to understand that to win the right to profit by being part of Australia's future submarines program, they must not just supply us with designs or products or expertise. They need to be willing to share with us their skills, technology, intellectual property, and perhaps even workforce for a time. Companies with the most relevant and sufficient capacity and capability, who are also willing to share with us and with others, some of whom might be natural competitors, in a tightly controlled IP environment, will be the ones most likely to profit. These are some of the many lessons that we've learned from our Collins experience. We've learned a lot from that experience. In combat systems, weapons, signature management, logistics, maintenance, engineering, and more, and we're still learning. The lessons of those learnings influence very heavily the advice that I provide on this program to government. I've traversed from the future to the here and the now a bit, to Collins, on which I'll close, because it's from here that we must begin. In respect of Collins, I want to say two things. First, to reiterate, Australian tradesmen and women built the Collins-class submarines to world-class standards, just as we have built many other complex naval ships in this country for almost a century. There is no problem with the Collins-class submarines that was caused by poor Australian workmanship. The problems that we have and have solved all are either a product of our own inexperienced decisions early in that program, or we imported them from overseas. the thousands of Australians involved in building the Collins-class submarines richly deserve great credit for what they did so well, and we can do that again. Second, Australia's submariners are acknowledged internationally as having achieved remarkable things over almost a century now, but especially over the last 40 or so years. They are still doing so today in the Collins class. Australia's submariners also deserve great credit for what they achieve with what they have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that enlightening review of the Future Submarine program and its intended development path. Truly a complex program. We now move on to our second speaker, Professor Henry Ergas, who is the Senior Economic Advisor at Elliott and inaugural Professor of the Infrastructure Economics at the Smart Infrastructure Facility at the University of Wollongong. Henry Ergas will provide us today his insight to Australian naval shipbuilding and take us through a journey which will lead us to the build of the Collins program, of the Future Submarine program, and will contrast to the discussion points that Admiral Moffitt has just taken us through.
Thank you, Chairman. Doesn't seem to work. On current plans, the Navy will acquire 12 conventional submarines, 8 frigates, and 20 multi-role offshore patrol vessels over the next 20 years. In each case, the vessels will be substantially larger and more sophisticated than those they replace, and in the case of the submarines, more numerous by a factor of 2. Apart from the submarines, which the government has promised to assemble in South Australia, it is yet to be decided where these new vessels will be built. A great deal is at stake. The bill for the program will be at least $40 billion. Given what's involved, taxpayers have every right to expect value for money. How that expectation can best be met is the subject of this presentation and of the paper Andrew Davies, Mark Thompson and I are releasing today on the ASPE website. Before turning to the substance of that question, it is useful to recall some key features of the broader economic context for this vast program of naval acquisition. I want to emphasize 2 features in particular. First, despite sustained economic growth, population aging and rising healthcare costs will place increasing pressure on the Commonwealth budget. The government's 2010 intergenerational report estimates that with unchanged policy settings, the Commonwealth budget will enter permanent deficit in the latter 2020s. Less optimistic, but arguably more realistic projections of population growth bring that date forward to the early 2020s. Of course, permanent, ever-rising budget deficits are unsustainable, as European governments are learning to their pain. Rather, they ultimately force hard choices, and defence and the White Paper's ambitious proposals cannot expect to be quarantined from those choices when they come. Second, while that is occurring, our economy will experience significant volatility. There is no doubt the resource boom and the shift in our economy towards greater dependence on natural resources is a source of great prosperity. But it is also true that economies reliant on natural resources are exposed to pronounced swings in economic activity, reflecting swings in resource prices and hence in the terms of trade. This is not a new feature of Australia's economy. In every decade since 1960, Australia's terms of trade volatility has been 2 times greater than that for the OECD countries as a whole. But world commodity markets do now seem to be experiencing longer booms followed by larger, though not necessarily longer, busts. As and when that bust occurs and flows into our tax base, the budget pressures on defence will inevitably become all the more acute. These features of the broader economic context make it crucial that defence acquisition choices be as rigorous as possible, from the selection of capabilities through to the lifecycle management of the assets. Overall, new disciplines can and should be brought to the process by which we determine what to buy and how and where we buy it. Central to those disciplines must be careful evaluation of costs and benefits. After all, choosing weapon systems is fundamentally an economic problem. That is, a problem in deciding how best to use our limited dollars. To do this properly, one must render explicit opportunity costs, that is, trade-offs between alternatives expressed in dollar terms, so as to ensure we get as much defence as we can from the scarce funding available. Stated in those abstract terms, this proposition would surely find broad agreement in this room. But it is a far cry from what actually happens. Rather, capability requirements are typically stated in absolute terms, without reference to their costs. This happens because the determination of force requirements is undertaken as a process that starts at the top with broad national objectives and then hierarchically derives from that a strategy, and from the strategy force requirements, which are then shoehorned into budgets at the last step. This approach is often ineffective and invariably inefficient. For having more of one system necessarily implies having less of another. Military requirements are therefore meaningful only in terms of benefits to be gained relative to their cost. It follows that the line of causation should not be thought of as running one way, from strategy to the forces, or for that matter, from budget to strategy. Rather, choices and options are highly interdependent. A requirement for a particular weapon system cannot be established independently of analysing what else could be done with the money. In saying this, I do not deny for a moment the difficulty of translating defence planning into dollar trade-offs between capabilities, costs, and consequences. But it is an inescapable fact that government budgets come in dollars, and hence decisions must ultimately be reduced to whether particular objectives deserve more dollars or fewer. Equally, I do not want to deny that defence decisions are ultimately political. But cost-benefit analysis can still help identify and hopefully eliminate the worst projects. Avoiding the worst, where one can't get the best, is no small accomplishment. This brings me to our specific focus today, the decisions that must be made about the sourcing of the future fleet. Let me start with a bit of history. For much of the 20th century, Australia manufactured, or at least assembled, a significant share of its defence equipment needs, on occasion even going so far as to develop and design its own weapon systems. Over time, however, the trend has been to rely more on foreign sources for major platforms and their component sensors and weapons. The last tank to be built in Australia was the locally designed Sentinel in World War II. The last artillery pieces built here were the British-designed Hamel guns in the late 1980s, and the last mortar tube, also British-designed, was in the 1960s. The tanks and artillery have since been replaced by imported equipment, and the same will likely occur for the mortars. The situation is similar for aircraft. Only helicopters continue to be assembled in Australia, albeit almost entirely from imported components. Australia's shift to foreign sources for defence materiel is consistent with international trends. As the unit cost of weapon systems has significantly outpaced inflation, countries have purchased fewer assets and retained them for longer. The number of weapons produced has fallen dramatically, eroding scale economies and boosting the share of costs due to system development. Because developmental costs are difficult to predict for highly complex systems, overall cost risks have increased along with unit costs. Combined, these factors have led to widespread industry consolidation and an increasing number of multinational programs. In light of these trends, it has not made sense for Australia to go it alone in manufacturing, let alone developing its own system. Where we have tried to do so, as with the Collins submarines, ALR 2001 radar warning receiver, the Sea Sprite helicopter, HF modernization project, and the AEW&C aircraft, the efforts have been plagued by delays, cost overruns, and cancellations. However, naval shipbuilding has not followed the general trend of increasing overseas sourcing. As the slide shows, following a surge in domestic construction during and immediately after World War II, domestic construction abated to the point where key combatants were imported from overseas between the mid-1960s and 1985. Then, following the sale of the government's long-troubled shipyards to the private sector, a series of major projects commenced in country. As a result, Australia now relies less on overseas shipyards than at any time since Federation. That shift to domestic construction has delivered very mixed results. With the exception of the Anzac frigates and of the LHD, which is still at its early stages, every project has suffered material adverse variances from initial commitments. Additionally, there is little doubt that the preference for local construction has involved a significant price premium, reflecting the relatively high costs of domestic shipbuilding. That Australian shipbuilding should involve a cost penalty is unsurprising. The reality is that market forces drive countries to specialize in line with their comparative advantage. Where a country is said to have a comparative advantage in the production of a particular good relative to some other country, if it has lower opportunity costs of production, i.e., if supplying that good entails a relatively smaller sacrifice of other production. Now, those opportunity costs are in the first instance shaped by factor endowments, that is, by international differences in the availability of labor, capital, and natural resources. Compared to other high-income economies, Australia has a very significant endowment of natural resources, including minerals and abundant agricultural land, relative to its endowments of other factors of production. Withdrawing productive inputs from mining and agriculture to use them in areas such as naval production or naval construction, therefore has a high opportunity cost. As a result, the exchange rate and domestic input and output prices will, if left to their own devices, adjust so as to make it unattractive to produce goods such as vessels locally, while making it attractive to produce goods more closely related to our natural resource endowments and use the resulting export proceeds to import vessels and other manufactured goods. Now, it's important to understand, but it's very frequently not understood, that this outcome would emerge even if naval construction had higher levels of productivity in Australia than overseas, so long as we were relatively even more efficient in producing goods based on natural resources. To that extent, and given just how pronounced our comparative advantage in resource-based activities is, for Australian naval shipbuilding to be competitive, it would need to have productivity levels that were well above international standards. In practice, however, our productivity levels in naval shipbuilding are unlikely to meet that test. After all, Australian shipbuilding has been a stop-start affair with production of small numbers of disparate types. But in naval shipbuilding, there are substantial economies of scale that arise from the ability to spread fixed costs and from learning by doing. So small production runs incur significant cost penalties. Combined, the relative price effects of comparative advantage, which are overwhelming, and the lack of economies of scale mean Australian naval shipbuilding is only commercially viable if it is protected from imports. The extent of the protection that has been given is difficult to estimate, as cost and price data is rarely public. However, reliable estimates can be provided for the AWD and LHD projects. Those estimates show that the domestic component of the AWD and LHD projects attract extremely high rates of protection, where those rates are measured in terms of the gain in domestic value added per dollar of import saved. That indicator, known as the effective rate of assistance, is the measure conventionally used by the Productivity Commission. Calculated on a basis strictly comparable to the Productivity Commission's methodology, the effective rates of assistance to the AWD and LHD projects can be estimated at 33% and over 70%, respectively. Now, it is crucial to understand just how high those effective rates of assistance are. For 2009-10, the average effective rate of assistance for manufacturing industry was 4.4%, for mining 0.2%, and for primary production 4.7%. A closer disaggregation shows that the rates of assistance provided to the AWD and LHD projects are 3 to 6 times those for the most heavily protected manufacturing industry, textiles, clothing, and footwear, whose effective rate of assistance is below 13%. And these estimates understate the actual degree of assistance to those projects. This is because they are based on expected costs for the AWD and LHD at the time of contract close, and hence take no account of the greater risk inherent in new local construction projects. Thus, while headline defence project costs have largely stayed within budget, delays have been frequent and substantial. And these delays are costly, even if those costs are typically left unquantified. Not only do we incur the strategic cost of going without a weapons system deemed necessary to Australia's defence for a time, often for years, but there is also the additional and rising cost of operating aging platforms beyond their planned life. Given these additional burdens, the estimated levels of protection shown in this slide for the AWD and LHD projects, though very high, understate the assistance's actual extent and hence its economic costs. Those economic costs take 3 major forms. First and most obvious, as the price at which we acquire vessels rises, we tend to buy fewer vessels. To illustrate this process, the slide plots a short ship affordability index based on real unit cost escalation for US Navy acquisitions of DDGs as against the number of surface combatants in the US Navy over the period 1960-2010. Broadly, as costs rise, vessel numbers fall proportionately. To that extent, when costs are incurred unnecessarily, we are forced to inefficiently reduce the scale of the defence we provide. Second, if the cost increase is not fully offset by a reduction in demand, spending on defence must rise, and with it, taxation. Since taxes distort economic behaviour, the result is to reduce Australia's well-being. Third and last, as resources are devoted to naval shipbuilding from activities that are less protected, the efficiency with which we use our factor endowments is reduced, and our prosperity with it. It is sometimes argued that adopting a long-term program of continuous naval construction in Australia could reduce or even overcome any cost gap between Australian and foreign shipbuilding, allowing further domestic construction to be secured with less or even no assistance. Given how large the cost gap is, the proposition must be extremely doubtful. But one cannot rule out the possibility that benefits could flow from such a long-term program of naval construction. Looking forward, there is more than enough work to keep a single shipyard busy, but through a program of disparate vessel types. It is therefore useful to consider 2 variants of continuous local production. First, aggregating that production of disparate vessel classes together under a single shipbuilder, and second, adopting a rolling production program either for a single class of vessel or between similar classes of vessel. Starting with the first of these options, all else equals, some economies could be obtained by having a single shipyard undertake continuous or overlapping programs involving disparate vessel types. But whatever the net advantage of these factors, there is a critical problem. This option involves awarding a monopoly to a single entity. Such monopolies have historically been less than hotbeds of efficiency. Indeed, past experience with the government-owned shipyards and current experience with submarine maintenance under ASC demonstrates the corrosive consequences of guaranteed workflow. And while the inherent risks of monopoly supply can be mitigated through competitive subcontracting of module construction, this comes at the expense of reducing economies of scale and duplicating fixed production overheads, precisely the effects the approach is intended to avoid. Moreover, once the monopoly was established, it would be difficult to subject it to foreign competition. Doing so would undermine the predictability of load that is assumed to generate the promised savings. In addition, vested interests would work to escalate the political costs of reversing the decision, allowing inefficiency to become entrenched, as it has in other parts of our local defence procurement. It is therefore hardly surprising that the government rejected the recommendation of the 2002 NSR sector plan to establish a monopoly shipbuilding entity. Turning now to the option of rolling production, it would, given our projected levels of demand, require us both to slow construction, thus preventing efficient labour force utilisation, and to retire vessels early so as to maintain work for the shipyard. Both of these involve substantial excess costs. The industry tail would be wagging the acquisition dog at taxpayers' expense. Additionally and importantly, establishing a rolling production program to capture the benefits of continuous production assumes future demand is assured for decades hence. However, the obvious risk is that economic, strategic, technological developments will lead to changes in the type, number, and timing of acquisitions. Certainly, current demand for vessels by the Navy was not anticipated in 2000 or 1990, let alone 1970 or 1980. Given that it is already questionable whether present demand is high enough to justify a rolling program, it would not take much to tip the balance. As a result, these options are neither desirable nor plausible. Moreover, even were such a policy adopted, it is less likely to eliminate cost gaps than to create new ones, as the monopoly power it creates is exploited and as the loss of flexibility reduces the benefit the community obtains from the naval construction program. The high relative costs of local sourcing are therefore likely to persist. Given those high costs, the issue must be whether they are offset by commensurate benefits. Allow me to touch on 4 arguments frequently claimed to provide a strategic rationale for domestic naval construction. These are that it is necessary if we are to acquire the particular naval capabilities we require, necessary for sustaining and upgrading vessels in peacetime, necessary for sustaining and adapting vessels in wartime, and necessary to preserve sovereign independence of action. The first of these claims makes no sense. From an engineering perspective, if it is feasible to build a vessel in Australia, it will be feasible to do so overseas. The fact that future vessels will almost certainly be based on foreign designs further bolsters the argument that foreign yards are capable of meeting any specific demands we may have. Where problems can arise is in handling intellectual property from different suppliers. But in the case of surface vessels, this concern is clearly misplaced. European countries routinely integrate US weapons and sensors onto their surface combatants. We need look no further than our own air warfare destroyer project for confirmation. This leaves submarines, traditionally one of the more sensitive areas of military technology. In terms of the actual weapons, there is no obvious difficulty. However, the United States is especially sensitive about its submarine combat systems, even though a Lockheed Martin combat system is being incorporated onto Spanish submarines. Were Australia to have its submarines built in Europe, we might have to accept a European combat system or retrofit a US system post-construction in Australia. The former should be tested on cost-benefit grounds, as it may not be undesirable, and the latter is entirely possible, as demonstrated by the replacement of the Collins combat system. Turning to the second claim, the tyranny of distance makes it impractical for Australia to rely on foreign yards to repair and maintain its vessels in peace times. Fortunately, it is not necessary to build a vessel in order to be able to sustain and operate it. Over its history, the RAN has successfully operated 70 major foreign-built vessels. Examples of Australia operating platforms built in foreign yards but successfully sustained domestically are the Oberon submarines and the Charles F. Adams destroyers. And the Collins shows conclusively that construction in Australia is no guarantee of an adequate capacity for domestic sustainment. It is sometimes asserted that Australia needs to be able to not just repair and maintain its vessels, but also to upgrade them in country. But experience shows that upgrades can be performed domestically using existing maintenance capabilities, provided that the necessary IP and systems integration expertise are available. Past instances include the successful upgrades of the Oberons and the DDG destroyers. Finally, it has been claimed that local construction helps reduce sustainment costs. Indeed, the three big programs of the 1990s, Collins, ANZAC, and the Mine Hunters, were all predicated on either reduced or static operating costs. But as the vessels entered service, the true cost of parent Navy ownership became apparent. The lesson to be drawn from these experiences is that far from reducing life cycle costs, the more Australia-unique our platforms are, the higher the burden we will have to carry through the life of the vessels. As regards sustainment in wartime, sustaining naval vessels during a conflict introduces two issues: rapid modifications to counter enemy capabilities and battle damage repairs. In the first case, the situation is as for upgrades. The critical factor is not where the vessels were built, but the quality of the peacetime sustainment regime and its access to IP and software. In the case of battle damage repairs, the question is clouded by the scarcity of data on the damage likely to arise in a modern conflict. But we must ask how important this capability actually is. If moderate to major damage occurs, the time taken for repair at even a manufacturer's yard is likely to exceed the duration of modern conflict. For instance, it took 11 months to repair the USS Cole after a suicide attack, and 15 months for the USS Stark after it was struck by 2 Exocet missiles. But even this might be overly optimistic, given the lethality of modern weapons. Of the 4 Royal Navy vessels damaged during the Falklands conflict, only 1 was able to return to service. The fourth and last claim is that our sovereign independence might be compromised if our strategic interests diverge from those of our supplier. While this possibility cannot be denied, in most circumstances, the costs of complete self-reliance mean there is no realistic option but to accept and manage that risk. In any event, our dependence on foreign suppliers is already entrenched in the advanced subsystems aboard our vessels, quite irrespective of where the hull is fabricated or assembled. To believe otherwise is a dangerous fantasy. Overall, the claimed strategic benefits of local construction are at best unproven, at worst implausible. As for claimed benefits in terms of multiplier effects, these wider benefits, that is, job creation, they are based on the assumption that were it not for these programs, the highly skilled workers shipbuilding employs would live in trees eating nuts while waiting for new vessels to be commissioned. Similar fallacies underpin other common claims, such as the curious argument that using taxpayer money to build ships is desirable because the people taxpayers pay to build them will themselves pay part of their income in taxes. The best that can be said for these arguments is that in the great class of sequiturs, they are a non. In conclusion, since the late 1980s, the trend has been to rely on domestic production for a historically high share of the naval program. The overall result has been to impose unnecessary burdens on taxpayers and distort resource allocation, not only in the economy as a whole, but in defence itself, as high costs erode our ability to fund the capabilities needed for the defence of Australia. Simply put, we've paid more and gotten less. The goal of defence self-reliance cannot justify bearing these excess costs. Complete self-reliance is not possible in any case. Policy is therefore a matter of degree in which the appropriate extent of self-reliance must be determined by balancing costs and benefits. As a result, the penalties associated with domestic shipbuilding should only be accepted if they are offset by commensurate benefits. But while such benefits are often claimed, closer examination reveals them to be slight or non-existent. Given that the excess costs calculated over the entirety of the Future Fleet program, could amount to many billions of dollars, the loss to Australian society from continuing to willy-nilly protect domestic military shipbuilding could be extremely high. There is also the loss, more difficult to quantify but no less real, should the high cost of building ships in this country force us to settle for a smaller fleet or scale back unnecessarily elsewhere in the Defence Force. The case for perpetuating the current preference for domestic production is therefore very weak indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ergas, for that deep technical analysis of the economic and strategic implications of maintaining an Australian naval shipbuilding industry. Indeed, a significant contribution in the ongoing debate on shipbuilding in Australia, and one that is, of course, timely for the Future Submarine program, the offshore combatant vessels, and, of course, the Anzac-class replacement program that is coming in the future. We'll now turn to, we have approximately 15 minutes for questions. There are a number of microphones in the aisle at the front, 4 of. I would request that unless I have someone that can actually take a microphone out to someone up the back, that you come down to those microphones and use them. So do we have questions of our speakers, please?
Hello, Mark Thompson from ASPI. I've got a question for Admiral Moffitt. I was fascinated with the outline you gave of the Future Submarine program based around a 2-year delivery schedule. I was wondering what the consequences of that were for life of type extensions and management of the present Collins fleet in order to maintain continuity of capability through the transition.
It's difficult to be definitive because the pictures I painted were theoretical, applying those theoretical pictures to a real submarine and then applying that real submarine in the theory to the current Collins circumstances is still theoretical. But if we buy an off-the-shelf submarine, the size of those blocks that I had in my graphics will be different, and the total length obviously will be different. And the other thing that will cause the outcome to be different is whether or not, with each new submarine that comes into service, a Collins class departs. And that's the question that I was touching on with how quickly our strategic circumstances and or government requirements cause us to want to grow the fleet to 12. The two models of replace with each new submarine as opposed to keeping the 6 Collins running for as long as we can, probably by extending their life and growing the force as quickly as we can, bring two very different answers. And that's something that government has to consider. A MOTS acquisition versus a new design acquisition bring even more fundamentally different answers. So the trade space within which we're working and within which I would have to answer the question, Mark, is sort of wide open, really. I know that doesn't answer your question, but it's very hard to answer your question because wherever you sit in that trade space will give you a potentially quite different set of answers. We may need to get more life out of the Collins class depending on what we choose to acquire. On the other hand, we may not. We may choose to keep them running longer anyway because we might want to grow the force more quickly, but we may not.
Vice Admiral Robin Dhawan, the Vice Chief of Naval Staff, Indian Navy. My question is for Admiral Moffitt. Thank you for providing a very deep insight and an enriching insight into your submarine construction program. My question is related to the firming up of your staff requirements. In a program that is spread over 20 years, with the first submarine likely to roll out at the end of 20 years, how do you propose to firm up your staff requirements? If you keep them too flexible, it may end up in cost and subsequent time overruns. if you keep them too rigid, you may have technologies which are outdated and even obsolete. Could you please comment on that?
Well, we're still quite a long way short of being at a point where we'll be seeking government agreement on how we would execute the program. But there are a couple of givens, I think, Admiral, to be clear about in answering your question, which is a very good one. It's a very challenging set of propositions that we face in this program, and what you've touched on is one. But one thing must be crystal clear. We must never start building something until the design is finished. That was not what we did with Collins. For the design to be finished, the capability requirement must be set and fixed. And we must accept that technology will move on during the build of each batch of submarines. And in the event that we adopt a model which says that we will insert technology advances in a batch structured program, another part of the equation will then become, and will we choose thereafter to insert those technology advances by retrofit into earlier submarines? I would say there will be some technologies where to do that will not be terribly invasive or intrusive, or technologically or schedule or risk or industrially all that difficult. But there will be some that we will simply accept will not be retrofitted to earlier submarines. For example, assuming that at some point in the build program we move from lead-acid batteries into lithium batteries, the likelihood of us retrofitting lithium batteries into earlier batches of lead-acid submarines, I think, would be very low. So the answer to the question is that we have to fix the design for each batch, whether the batch is 2 or 10, before construction begins. And for the things that come along where we might actually do modifications to the design, that might be relatively small, we would consider putting them in at some later stage. But this is what you've touched on is one of the fundamentally different aspects of the nature of the future submarine program that we're considering, that we have not hitherto experienced. All of our previous classes of ships, pretty much, up to and including the largest class in modern times, the Anzac class, were very substantially the same as the first one. There were differences, but they were very substantially the same.
Rear Admiral Trevor Rooting, Royal Australian Navy Reserve. For Professor Ergas, you quote some quite high figures from the Productivity Commission of the additional costs, or the, as you say, the effective overhead of producing the AWDs and the LHDs in Australia. I have a couple of questions related to those and then your subsequent analysis. With respect to the air warfare destroyers, a common rule that we have used in a number of our programs is that the non-recurring engineering costs associated with getting a build program running in Australia about equates to the cost of one entire ship. So your figure of 33% for a 3-ship program is not, one might say, unrealistic. For the LHDs, though, I ask, did your figures from the Productivity Commission take into account that, in fact, the hulls are produced in Spain? And secondly, how do you relate these figures for very short production runs associated with both of those programs with the programs that you are talking about for the future, which is 20 OCVs, 12 submarines and 8 frigates? The economics and the equations, I would believe, would be substantially different in those circumstances, particularly noting, as you did comment positively, the Anzac program was able to produce ships at a very well competitive rate for each unit.
Just to clarify, the numbers I quoted for the AWD and the LHD are not from the Productivity Commission. they are estimates made using the Productivity Commission's methodology, and so they are strictly comparable to the estimates the Productivity Commission publishes every year for the other parts of the Australian economy. And what I did in that slide was to compare the estimates for the AWD and the LHD to similar estimates that the Productivity Commission made for 2009-10 for manufacturing, mining, and so on. So those are not Productivity Commission estimates, but they are made using the same essential methodology. Now, I'm not sure you've quite grasped, and perhaps I didn't explain it clearly, but it is explained in the longer paper that Andrew Davies, Mark Thompson, and I have released today on the ASPE website, exactly what is involved in calculating these effective rates of assistance. But these effective rates of assistance are not price premia or conventional price differences as such. Rather, the best way to think about them is that what the effective rate of assistance measures is how much resource cost you engage, how big a sacrifice you make, so as to obtain an additional dollar of value added in Australia. Okay? And one result of that is that if you produce most of the components overseas, and then all you do in Australia is some assembly, so there's not a huge amount of value added, then even a quite small cost or price premium can translate into a very high effective rate of assistance, because so as to get each dollar of that value added, you're paying a premium on the whole price of the product. Okay? And that is what accounts for the difference in the effective rates of assistance as between the AWD and the LHD. As I said, those estimates are very generous to those two projects, and I suspect that ex post estimates would be even higher. I suspect that's also true for almost all of the projects that I listed in the table that looked at the projects that have been undertaken since the rise in domestic shipbuilding in the late 1980s. I would be very surprised if any of those projects, on the numbers I've seen, had effective rates of assistance that were below 30%. And I suspect some of them would have effective rates of assistance that were closer to 80 or 90%. And what that means is that effectively, for those programs, so as to buy $1 of value added in Australian shipbuilding, we've sacrificed between $1.3 and $2 in the economy as a whole. And I just cannot believe that the benefits of doing that outweigh those high costs. And so far, at least, no one has provided a compelling rationale for why those benefits would indeed exceed those costs.
The gentleman in front.
Sam Tangreddy. Oh, I'm sorry. You, sir.
I've had two people jump in ahead of me already. Neil James from the Australia Defence Association. I've got two quick questions for Professor Ergas. The first one is, and I don't think too many people would argue about his points about the construction of systems and platforms, but would he extend his economic rationalist arguments into arguing against Australian production of consumables, chiefly munitions, which we would obviously need to produce domestically because the conflict might last longer before we run out? And my second point is simply, I note that the team that prepared his report didn't include an historian or indeed a strategist or indeed anyone from the profession of arms. did you actually look back in your study to the 80s and 90s, where our decisions on force structuring were actually driven by the dollars, and the strategy and the politics was adjusted to suit the dollars that were thought to be available politically, rather than being a product of robust strategic assessment? And did your study of the problems of shipbuilding, which essentially is from the 1990s onwards, actually look back to that dreadful period of the 70s, 80s and 90s, where the Defence Force didn't get the kit they needed because the dollars were thought not to be available?
In terms of your first question about consumables, look, it seems to me that there too, the fundamental issue that needs to be addressed is what the costs and benefits are of domestic production. And to the extent to which domestic production does have benefits that exceed its costs, what the most efficient way is of securing those benefits. That was indeed the entire intention of the priority industry capability concept that was set out in the Defence Industry Review some years ago, and that has since been restated. The whole idea was defined carefully in terms of costs and benefits exactly why capability is a priority, and then use that to assess what the most efficient, cost-effective way is of, if a capability is strategic or a priority, ensuring that you have access to that capability. For instance, in the case that you cite of consumables, are there ways of ensuring that there are options to produce, and to produce effectively, without actually undertaking current production? Are there ways or balances between stockpiling, between holding inventories, between managing production capacity, between having option contracts on capacity, that allow you to, through that complex of ways, ensure the access to the capability that you genuinely do need, but to do so in a way that's providing value for money? And that's the assessment that, in my view, needs to be made in that area. With respect to your second question about the three of us who produced a paper on the ASPE that is released today on the ASPE website, if I may, in modest defense of my co-authors, I suspect you would find that my co-authors are as familiar as anyone else could be with precisely those issues to do with the history of our acquisition over time. And I would certainly hope that we have taken account of the lessons of that history in our paper. And if we haven't, let me first of all invite you and everyone else who has the time to download and read it. And if we haven't done so, well then obviously we would very much welcome your comments.
Sam Tungretti from the US for Professor Ergas. In your study, did you take a look or try to assess the potential for technology innovation from the development of a Australian submarine building infrastructure? Seems to me that building an infrastructure allows one to develop innovations that perhaps would be both marketable or applicable elsewhere, acoustic engineering innovations, materials, that sort of thing. Sort of developments that can't be done if you don't have an infrastructure that actually is looking at those problems. Is that something that you assessed in your study?
Well, this is I mean, that's a good question, and it's a long-standing issue. It's really the view that there are what are sometimes referred to as spin-offs to the wider economy, technological spin-offs or wider technological benefits that accrue from the design of complex weapon systems such as submarines. The basic notion, simply put, is that if you engage in design and construction of those submarines, then that propels technology and skills including design skills, not merely in that weapon system, but also has broader gains in other parts of the economy. Now, the evidence on that is very mixed. It needs to be borne in mind that and there have been hundreds and hundreds of studies of this issue over the years in different countries, but the evidence suggests that, yes, there can be spin-offs, but there are also some negative effects as well as positive effects. And those negative effects arise because building things for devices such as submarines is extremely different as a technological proposition from commercial innovation and from the approach that is required for commercial innovation. And so, whilst you get positive spin-offs, you also get some negative technological consequences of devoting significant technological resources to projects of this kind. There's an additional, and I think very important point that, to my mind, comes out clearly if you look at our experience with Collins. And that point is the following, is that, yes, there are some spin-offs. I would query how big they were, but there are some, but they're probably very small. They're not so much spin-offs quite in the terms that you suggested. There's a few spin-offs, for instance, in terms of training and workforce skills. Okay? But if you said to yourself, how much would it cost to buy those spin-offs directly? Would it cost $7 billion to get that workforce training? Would it cost $7 billion to train a few people in project management? Right? Or if we used 1% of that, could we still get the bulk of those spin-offs? I think you would have to come to the conclusion that even if there were such spin-offs, this was not a cost-effective way of securing them.
Due to the time, we'll have one more question from the gentleman.
Okay, Norman Friedman from the United States. Something's missing. When you look at the Collins class, it was designed for a very unusual requirement. The RAN had to go a lot further than most people who operate conventional subs. A lot of the problems with the Collins class came because it appeared to be off the shelf, but it wasn't. Had it been built in Sweden where it was conceived, it would have had most of the same problems that it ended up with here. And probably they would not have been fixed as easily or as quickly. As far as what you get out of these things, there are a couple of things that I don't know how you quantify. One is, if you look at the economics, the obvious payoff is to limit the country to producing primary goods, minerals, sheep, things like that. You might imagine that Australians would like a higher technological component in their lives. And you can't buy that. You have to grow it locally. If you do the economics, you may be leaving out something that matters. The other thing is, what Sam Tangredi was talking about wasn't just spin-offs. If you devise things which are saleable as part of weapon systems, other people buy them as parts of their systems. If you look around this exhibit, you discover, for example, the phased array that CEA did. No one will buy any of that stuff unless it's on your own ships. They just won't. And the ships are the closest to something uniquely Australian. Submarines, because they get no support while they're out there, are the closest to something you need for your own requirements. To imagine that you can buy those things off the shelf just doesn't work. If you look at who builds submarines right now, they build shorter range subs that really don't fit. So you end up buying a design that really doesn't have any of your own input in it. And don't kid yourself about that. It won't show up in the numbers, but what you'll get will kill people. That may not be totally satisfactory.
Can I
Sorry.
just give a quick response to that. First of all, let me agree with you that the issue is not solely that of domestic construction. It's also that of where we have Australian unique requirements. The moment you introduce those Australian unique requirements, you introduce very significant risk and typically very significant cost. Now, what that means, in my view, is that you have to subject those Australian unique requirements to extremely careful cost-benefit appraisal. And I'm not the only one saying that. I mean, that was a central recommendation of the Mortimer Review. It was a central recommendation of the Pappas Review. And in both cases, they made those recommendations because, and it's worth emphasizing this point, because we don't do enough of it. We don't take that seriously. We don't say, yes, this would be nice to have, but the increment in cost and risk is not worth that benefit. And that's what we need to do. And we need to do that with the submarines to as great an extent as we need to do it with at least any of the equipment we buy. Where that leads, I agree, is an open question. But that analysis must be done, and it must be done carefully. On your second point, which is to say we should build these things because if we build these things that will enhance our capabilities, and otherwise all we'll be doing is digging dirt out of the ground and shearing sheep. With all respect, I suggest that you go to an Australian farm and an Australian mine. Australian farms are amongst the most technologically advanced in the world. Australian mines are the most technologically advanced in the world. We operate the heaviest iron ore trains anywhere in the world. We have the highest degree of automation of those mines. We are leading the world in the introduction of robotics into those mines, and the goal of all three of our major iron ore miners is to have fully automated mines within a decade, which is far ahead of anything else in the world. Now, they don't do that because we built Collins. And if you think they do that because we built Collins, then I suggest you speak to them. Because what you would find is that the reason they do that is because they have extremely deep technological capabilities and project management capabilities of their own. Indeed, doing things like building advanced weapon systems increases the cost to them of remaining the world's most technologically advanced miners and remaining at the forefront of global agricultural technology. That's a real opportunity cost. It's an opportunity cost that we pay for in terms of our long-run prosperity, and it's an opportunity cost that policymakers and advisors involved in taking these admittedly extremely complicated decisions that they have to take, and I hope do take, fully into account.
Thank you for those questions, certainly fueling debate. Admiral Moffitt and Professor Ergas, thank you for your insightful presentations today. That ends today's session. I'd like you to join me in thanking them in the normal manner. Thank you.